recently uploaded video, I made a passing comment as to when it comes to the best driver in a mid-tier car, Giancarlo Fisichella is one of the greatest, if not the greatest. But was Fizzy actually that good? Now, most of us will know Fisichella as a driver in Formula 1, but pre-F1 he was racing in touring cars, driving in DTM and the ill-fated International Touring Car Championship for Alfa Romeo, and during that 1995 season he was also Minardi's test driver. The following year, this unrated yet up-and-coming Italian graduated to Formula 1 as a full-on driver, completing the lineup alongside Portuguese driver Pedro Lamy and replacing the outgoing Luca Badoa, who had moved on to 40. It wasn't a permanent slot, however, as Minardi needed drivers with money to ensure its survival, while also using that money to develop the car to be able to finish within the 107% qualifying rule, which 40 would often be at the mercy of, before 40 went bankrupt just before the German Grand Prix of 1996. Fisichella would only do half of the 1996 season, 8 races of the 16, but he'd somehow done enough to attract the attention of Eddie Jordan, who snapped him up to replace the retiring Martin Brundle. Now, Fizzy's peak of the 1997 season could have been the German Grand Prix, where he was actually on course to win, but a puncture in the latter stages cost him, and Gerhard Berger went on to win the race instead. He also scored a second place at a wet Belgian Grand Prix and then 2 fourth places at Monza and the A1 ring, before finishing the season on a whimper. He had the same amount of points finishes as Ralph, but ended the season with 20 versus Ralph's 13. Okay, not an absolute demolition, but considering Ralph was always being compared to Michael, it's a good start. Now, Fisichella's performances during the 1997 season attracted the attention of Benetton, who signed him up for the 1998 season. Now, Benetton was in a sort of decline phase, but also trying to rebuild because they were trying to emulate the glory days of Schumacher in 1994 and 1995. But Renault had since left Formula 1, leaving Benetton with these outdated, rebranded Renault engines that they were just going to be struggling with. And alongside Fisichella was Alex Wurz, and between them they made up the youngest driver pairing on the grid for 1998. Even though Wurz outscored Fizzy in 1998, it was by a single point. Wurz was showing more of the potential he'd shown in 1997 when he substituted for Gerhard Berger, but Fizzy failed to finish one more race than Alex did, but in this period managed to get 2 podium finishes at Monaco and Montreal, as well as getting pole position at the A1 ring, making sure he was in the right place at the right time to take pole from Jean Alesi's Sauber, and managed to have the 2 title contenders in Hakkinen and Schumacher behind him in 3rd and 4th. But while he was able to hang with Schumacher and Hakkinen for a time in the race, Fizzy undid all of his Saturday heroics by wiping out Jean Alesi at turn 2. Yes, it's turn 2, not turn 3. That mistake is probably what cost him beating Wurz that season, as Alex was in 9th that race. Wurz and Fisichella would remain teammates during the 1999 season, but aside from a podium at Montreal, that's as good as it got for the Italian. The results were starting to come few and far between, and Benetton's decline was really starting to show. They were teammates again in 2000, but for 2001 Fisichella got a new teammate in Jenson Button, who he also beat, but at the end of the 2001 season, it was back to Jordan. Now, Jordan, like Benetton, had been in decline since its glory year of 1999. The car wasn't competitive at all, but despite this, Fizzy got himself 7 points while Takuma Sato could only get 2. But it was at Jordan that Fizzy would get his first win, being in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the red flag caused at the end of the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix. Now, while I say he was in the right place at the right time, and that might go against the whole "but you said he was good in mid-cars" thing, remember that this was a race where not even Michael Schumacher could keep it on the road. So the general TLDR of all of this is that Fisichella was able to get decent results in cars that should have been knocking on the doors of points rather than scoring big points and podiums and even the win that he got in 2003. And then in 2004 he went to Sauber, hoping to use the experience at Sauber as a stepping stone to getting a Ferrari drive if Ferrari decided to replace Rubens Barrichello. And there were rumours going around in 2002 that that was going to be the case. He was going to go to Sauber, Ferrari would evaluate him, and then make a decision some point in the next couple of years or whatever. But ironically, later on, it would be his Sauber teammate Felipe Massa that went to Ferrari instead. Now, there are a couple of caveats to all of this, because the only teammate that Fisichella had had up until this point that we can safely say was a threat was Jenson Button, or maybe Ralf Schumacher. Also, reliability might have put him into those positions more than pace would, but finding lists of when these kinds of drivers inherited points versus doing it on pace alone is impossible. I mean, there probably is somebody on Reddit somewhere that has put one together. But Martin Brundle did say that Fisichella was able to overperform in cars that weren't exactly great. But there is a catch to this. While Fisichella was able to overperform in cars that weren't exactly the best on the grid, when he finally did get a car that was really good, he underperformed. Case in point, Renault. While Fisichella won on his return to the former Benetton team at Melbourne in 2005, that was as good as it got for that season. While the Saturday session had been wet and the Sunday session dry for this new aggregate timing, one-shot qualifying, one-lap system, Fizzy had been fastest on Saturday and second fastest on Sunday, comfortably being faster on the Sunday versus Alonso. But for the rest of the season, Alonso dominated him, with retirements hampering the second Renault in 3 straight races at Malaysia, Bahrain and Imola. Now in Malaysia, Fisichella hit Webber, in Bahrain his engine blew, and he had another accident at Imola. But for the 2006 season, he just simply underperformed, much like Ricciardo has against Norris this season. And while Fisichella did win the Malaysian Grand Prix, that season was pretty much the Alonso and Schumacher show, and Fisichella only beat Alonso twice that season. But by this point, Fisichella's F1 career was entering its twilight phase, and after a poor 2007 season with Renault, he moved to the new Force India team, which was once Jordan. No points were scored during the 2008 season, and in 2009 things started to improve, but it took until mid-season to be able to do so. A pole at Spa was a shock and also highly celebrated, and he scored a podium at the end of that weekend, before circumstances finally got him in at Ferrari when he replaced the injured Felipe Massa. 9th, 13th, 12th, 10th and 16th were the results. Not exactly the dream job he might have been anticipating. Those were his last races as an F1 driver, and after that it was off to sports cars, where he was in a Ferrari at AF Corsa, and he did get podiums and a class win at Le Mans. So while this might have been just a long-form review of Fisichella's career in Formula 1, it serves to show you some highlights and lowlights. And actually, it might have challenged some rose-tinted looks back I might have had of the guy after saying he's one of the best mid-car drivers out there. Yes, he had some low-level teammates such as Lamy, Sato and so on, and yes, Sato has since won 2 Indy 500s while Fernando Alonso hasn't, and that's just part of the absolute craziness that is motor racing. But let's look now as to the reasons as to why Fisichella never really made it, as it were. It's possible that we could look at Fisichella like one of those football teams that absolutely rinses the second tier of English football, but when that team gets promoted to the Premier League, they get relegated first season there. He probably wasted too much time and years milling around in those lower cars, waiting or hoping for that Ferrari drive, only for him to be at the end of his career when it finally came. But despite all of this, Fisichella was able to get decent results in the late 1990s when the drivers around him were Hakkinen, Schumacher, Coulthard, Irvine, Barrichello, Villeneuve and people like that. But when the turn of the century rolled around, there were some new kids on the block that were being looked at and nurtured. Fisichella by this time would have been in his late 20s, and by the time some of the top teams could have been taking him seriously, there was new blood coming in. Fisichella was seen as a young prospect when he came in at Minardi, but the issue was he'd been born right at the tail end of the generation that was already established, and the generational talents in that bubble, if we can call it that. You know, the likes of Schumacher and Hakkinen, who were born at the end of the 1960s and therefore would have had a little more longevity compared to those around them. In that mix as well was Coulthard and Barrichello and Ralph and Villeneuve to an extent too, and this was the situation again at the end of the 1990s. So by the time Fisichella was in a position to move up, the seats were already filled with people who were seen to be more worth the investment, that group of drivers born at the tail end of the 1970s and into the 1980s. They were cheaper and had room to grow. Massa, Heidfeld, Raikkonen, Alonso and Button. And since Frank Williams was chasing Montoya for so long, Jensen was just keeping that Williams seat warm for Juan Pablo, so the door to one of the top 3 teams at the time was already shut. When Renault started to come on strong in around 2004 or so, Alonso was already showing he would one day be world champion material, and was Flavio Briatore's pet project like Vettel and Verstappen would be at Red Bull. And when Fisichella finally got to Renault, Alonso was at his best. Heidfeld was hotly rated after his junior career. Raikkonen was seen as the star of the future, and McLaren paid big money to get him out of Sauber to stop him going to Ferrari. McLaren was also happy with Coulthard being a solid number 2 for Kimi and a mentor also, and Frank Williams had been chasing Montoya as established, with Button seen as someone with potential also. Schumacher and Barrichello were the winning formula at Ferrari, so no need to change anything there. So when 2005 finally rolled around, Fisichella was 32. Alonso was 8 or 9 years younger and still had a little bit of room to grow. Fisichella's best years were behind him, and it was just too late. He was born too late to be in with the likes of the group above, and too early to be in with the group below. See also Mark Webber. But despite this, Fisichella was a solid mid-grid driver. You were virtually guaranteed points or even a podium with him in your team, and yes, he did get a win here and there as well. So, while circumstances might not have worked in his favour, he was still able to make the most of his talents for those teams at the time, and just, he wasn't able to get to a top team while he still had youth on his side. So I've presented some stuff here, and I'd like to know what you think. Was Fisichella a solid driver but a constant victim of circumstance that meant that when the opportunities finally came, he had other people there that were simply better than him, like Coulthard for instance? Or was he just made to look good by the calibre of his teammates? Let me know down in the comments. And while scrolling down, if I've given you food for thought, do give the video a like, and for more stuff like this, hit subscribe and get that bell on as well, so you never miss out on anything I do here. Massive thanks to the folks at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help me buy up images for these videos, the link is down in the description, where there's also links to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a cracking day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.